Douglas Mawson knelt in the snow and peeled the soles of both his feet clean off. He did not stop. He greased the raw flesh, tied the dead skin back on, and laced up his boots. Then he stood. He was 80 miles from a base camp that was about to sail away without him. He was alone. And the two men who had walked out here with him were both already dead. You think of Antarctica as empty, a blank white sheet at the bottom of the map. But in November of 1912, 3 men and 17 dogs walked east across that sheet, and only one of them ever walked back. This is the story of how he did it, and of the thing inside the food that was quietly killing him the whole way home. Start at the beginning, before the ice knew their names. Mawson was a geologist. 30 years old, Yorkshire-born, raised tough in the Australian bush. He had already turned down a place on Robert Scott's doomed expedition to the South Pole because he wanted his own. He got it. The Australasian Antarctic Expedition landed at Commonwealth Bay in early 1912, in a place so battered by wind that the average speed of the air there topped 50 miles an hour and sometimes hit 200. They called it the home of the blizzard. They were not being poetic. The wind there was not weather. It was a living thing that pinned men to the ground and tore tents out of their hands. His plan was to split into parties and map the coast. Mawson took the hardest assignment for himself, the Far Eastern Party. 3 men pushing hundreds of miles into territory no human being had ever seen. With him went Belgrave Ninnis, a young English lieutenant, and Xavier Mertz, a Swiss ski champion and mountaineer. Ninnis and Mertz had spent 18 months caring for the dogs. They knew each animal by name. Remember that? It matters later, in a way you will wish it did not. They set out on the 10th of November. For 5 weeks, everything went right. They crossed 2 enormous glaciers. They mapped coastline that had never appeared on any map. They ate through their supplies exactly as planned, and the sledges grew lighter, and the dogs pulled hard. By the middle of December, they were nearly 300 miles from home and feeling good about it. The hardest part, they thought, was behind them. It was in front of them, and it had no bottom. Then the ice opened. On the 14th of December, Mawson was riding on the front sledge, his weight spread out. Mertz was ahead on skis. Ninnis walked beside the second sledge on foot, because a walking man puts all his weight on one small patch of ground at a time. They had crossed 100 hidden crevasses already. This one was no different to look at. A lid of packed snow over a hole in the world. Mawson crossed it. Mertz crossed it. Ninnis walking broke through. Mawson felt nothing. He heard nothing. He only noticed, some moments later, that the whimper of the dogs behind him had stopped. He turned around. There was no Ninnis, no sledge, no team of 6 dogs. Just a clean blue hole in the snow where a man had been. They crawled to the edge and looked down. Far below on a ledge, maybe 150 feet down, they could see 1 dead dog and 1 still moving, moaning. Of Ninnis there was no sign at all. They called his name for hours into a hole that gave nothing back. They lowered every rope they had. It reached less than halfway. There was a moment, kneeling at that edge, when both men understood there was nothing to do and no way to do it, and that understanding was heavier than the cold. Here is what fell into that crevasse with Ninnis. The 6 strongest dogs, the tent, nearly all of the food, the spare clothing, the ground sheet, everything a person needs to survive on the ice, gone in a single silent second, because it had been loaded onto the second sledge, and the second sledge was the one that went down. Read a survival tip. Any of them. They tell you not to put all your eggs in one basket. Mawson knew that rule. He had followed it his whole life. And the ice took the basket anyway. They were now more than 300 miles from base with almost no food, no tent, and 6 exhausted dogs. Mertz and Mawson turned around and started walking home. They improvised a shelter from a spare tent cover stretched over a frame of skis and sledge runners, a thing that barely kept the wind out. And here begins the part of the story that people still argue about a century later, because what saved them was also what destroyed them. They had to eat the dogs. There was no other food. So one by one, as each animal weakened and could no longer pull, they shot it, and they ate it, and they fed the worst parts to the dogs still living. Mertz, the man who had raised these animals, who knew each one by name, had to do this. It broke something in him that never healed in the days he had left. The meat was tough and stringy and foul, so lean after weeks of starvation that it gave the men almost nothing back. But there was one part of each dog that was soft and easy to chew, and went down without a fight: the liver. Mawson wrote in his diary that it was a relief when the liver appeared, because at least it could be swallowed. He did not know. He could not have known. Nobody on Earth knew it yet. Inside the liver of a well-fed sled dog is a concentration of vitamin A so extreme that researchers later estimated the two men were swallowing well over 1 million units a day. A single serving carried many times a lethal human dose. The two starving men, desperate for anything that would go down easy, were eating the most poisonous part of every animal first. Your body needs vitamin A a tiny amount. In the amounts those men were swallowing, it stops being a nutrient and becomes a slow poison that attacks the fastest growing tissue you have: your skin, your hair, the lining of your brain. And the cruelest part is that it feels like nothing at first. You are eating. You are getting calories. You think you are being saved. Around New Year's Day, Mertz began to change. He went off his food. Some mornings he refused to leave his sleeping bag at all, and the miles they could not afford to lose slipped away while he lay there. Other times he flew into rages, thrashing, nearly wrecking the tent they had improvised from a spare cover. Then his skin began to come away. Not a scrape. Not frostbite. The skin of a living man peeling off in sheets. Mertz was a vegetarian by habit. He found the muscle meat repulsive and ate more of the liver than Mawson did. That single difference in taste is very likely why one man died and the other lived. Two men. The same journey, the same poison, and the whole outcome turning on which part of the dog each one could stomach. On the 7th of January, Mertz suffered a violent seizure. Then another. Sometime in the night, the Swiss ski champion who had climbed the highest peaks in the Alps, who had carried this expedition on his skis, died in a torn tent on the ice beside the one man left alive. Mawson buried him under blocks of snow, read a short service over him, and understood exactly where he now stood. One man, no dogs, half his food, and more than 100 miles of the worst surface on the planet between him and any human face. Now go back to the beginning of this story. The soles of his feet. The same poison that killed Mertz was inside Mawson too. On the 11th of January, he pulled off his socks and found that the entire soles of both feet had detached from the flesh beneath, come away whole, like insoles lifted out of a shoe. Under them, raw meat. He had 80 miles to walk on those feet. So he did the only thing there was to do. He smeared the raw skin with lanolin grease, placed the dead soles back where they belonged, bandaged them tight, and forced his ruined feet into his boots. Then he stood up and kept walking. Some days he made a single mile. Some days the surface was so bad and his body so weak that a single mile was the whole day's victory, paid for in blood inside his boots. One of those days was the 15th of January. That was the day his ride home, the ship Aurora, was scheduled to leave the base camp and sail for Australia. He was still 80 miles away, walking on feet that were falling apart, and the boat that could carry him to safety was preparing to abandon the coast. He had no way to signal it. No way to know if it had already gone. He simply walked toward a shore that might already be empty. 2 days later, on the 17th, the ice tried to finish him the way it had finished Ninnis. He was hauling the sledge across a snow bridge when it collapsed under him and dropped him into a crevasse. He fell, and then he stopped, jerked to a halt in mid-air, swinging over the dark. The only thing between him and the same hole that swallowed his friend was the rope of his sledge harness, and the sledge itself, which had wedged in the snow at the lip, instead of following him down. He hung there 14 feet below the surface, spinning slowly over nothing, his ruined feet dangling. He was so weak he could barely close his hands, and he made a decision that tells you everything about why this man came home when the other two did not. He climbed. Knot by knot up a rope, with peeling hands and detached feet, until he clawed over the edge and collapsed on the snow. And then, sometime later, the crumbling lip gave way again and dropped him a second time. And a second time, he climbed out. Most men do not have one climb like that in them. He found two. He kept walking. He found a cairn of supplies left by a search party who had passed by only hours before, with a note. The Aurora had waited as long as it could and then sailed. But 6 men had volunteered to stay behind at the base, through another brutal Antarctic winter on the chance that Mawson was still alive somewhere out on the ice. 6 men had bet a year of their lives on a ghost. On the 8th of February 1913, Douglas Mawson walked into Commonwealth Bay. He had left with 2 friends, 17 dogs, 3 sledges, and a full load of supplies. He came back alone, on foot, with his skin sloughing off and the soles of his feet tied on with string. The men who saw him first did not recognize him. One of them asked which one he was. He had walked at the end more than 300 miles, alone for the last 100, poisoned by the only food he had. And the thing you should sit with is not that he survived it. It is that at every single step, the sensible move, the reasonable move, was to lie down in the snow and stop. The soles come off your feet. Lie down. Your friend dies in the tent. Lie down. You are hanging on a rope over a black hole, too weak to grip. Let go.
He didn't, not once.
You will never cut the soles of your feet back into your boots. But you already know the feeling of the sensible thing being to quit, and the smaller, stubborn thing in you that stands up anyway. That stubborn thing is very old. It walked 17 dogs east and came home with none. It is the reason your species is still here at all. Mawson made a full recovery. He lived another 45 years. And the crevasse that took Belgrave Ninnis was never found, never opened, never searched. He is still down there, under the ice. Exactly where the world went quiet behind a man who turned around and saw an empty patch of snow.